Greetings and welcome to A Contemplative Reader, where together we will explore the mysterious, the mystical, the spiritual, and the otherworldly in various forms of literature. Today, instead of the normal analysis of the spiritual content of books that I have been offering on this channel, I will be observing the double nickel. Yes, earlier this month was my 55th birthday, so I'm going to go through my book collection and talk about 55 sci-fi and fantasy books that I've read at some point in time in my 55 years, and that have meant something to me. It might be something that I read 45 years ago. It might be something that I read last week. It's not a best of list. There's certainly lots of great books that I've read that are not going to be in this particular list, but I wanted to offer sort of a survey of my life's reading, at least as far as sci-fi and fantasy goes. This will be done alphabetically. So it's not a best of ranking in any way, shape, or form. There's one exception to that. There's a couple of franchises where I'm just going to insert the books from that franchise where the title of that franchise goes instead of by the authors of those series. Again, like I said, this is not a comprehensive list of every sci-fi and fantasy book I've read throughout my life. We'd be here for a lot longer. But I think what you find out is I read a lot of these books when I was young, and I've been trying to catch up now that I'm in my 50s. There was a long period of time where I didn't read a whole lot of sci-fi and fantasy or fiction in general, but there will be some books from that time period and from that kind of that 30-year gap in between youth and my 50s. So, without any further words, here we go. Beginning would be Douglas Adams, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Life, the Universe, and Everything. So long, and thanks for all the fish. These are copies that I picked up at a used bookstore in my hometown sometime in the 1980s, and I read them at that time. Quite a funny sci-fi story telling us the adventures of Arthur Dent and Zaphod Beeblebrox and Ford Prefect and various other characters. Along with reading the books at that time, what I do recall from my youth about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was the BBC series, which was shown on public television here in the United States. And so a lot of my memories of what the story is about probably are affected by my recollections of that show. Also, from the movie that came out, gosh, it's probably been 20 years ago now, there was a movie adaptation of this series. So these three books are at the start of my list here. Next, another Adams. This is Richard Adams, Watership Down, a classic story. I believe this was written in the 1960s. This copy is a trade paperback from the 1970s that, actually I see it was copyright 1972. And this is the printing from the late 1970s. I believe it was a tie-in with the movie that came out, the animated movie of Watership Down. As you see, there's a rabbit on the cover, and this is a story about rabbits, but they aren't necessarily cute and friendly rabbits all the time. It's quite a good story, which has a lot of adult themes in it. Again, this is a story that I read back in the 1980s, so I don't remember a lot of specifics. What this book is special to me, though, is that if you see the handwriting on the inside cover there, that is the writing of my grandmother, who gave this particular book to me as a gift, I think probably for my birthday sometime back in the 1980s. Next is a series I've read both as a youth and as an adult. So it is The Chronicles of Verdane by Lloyd Alexander. And I have here the books that I've read so far this year. The first book of the series, The Book of Three. The second book of the series, The Black Cauldron. And I have recorded and uploaded reviews of those books on my channel. So obviously these are more recent copies. I think when I read these books as a kid, I must have checked them out from the school library or town library, or perhaps my older brother might have had copies of them. But at any rate, I did not have copies as an adult, so I bought this 5 edition box set of the Chronicles of Prydain, and I'm really enjoying reading that particular series again. Another book that I read more recently, this is one that I read about 4 years ago, is Shadow and Bone by Lee Bardugo, which is the first book in the Grishaverse. And I bought this when the Netflix series came out. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try the book series as well. It's definitely in the YA category, including some of the YA tropes such as love triangles and the like. But what I remember liking about this particular book is that it's set in in a sort of a fantasy version of 1800s Tsarist Russia. So a lot of fantasy is set in medieval Western Europe, and this one has a different setting, which I enjoy since I have enjoyed studying and reading history from 19th century Russia. And of course, a lot of great literature comes from that time. I don't know if I'd classify this as great literature. It was a good book. I enjoyed it. I might read the rest of the books in the series at some point in time, but I haven't gotten to them yet. Another book series that I read a lot of as a kid, and that would be Oz by L. Frank Baum. Again, these books go all the way back to the early 1900s. This particular edition, Del Rey started putting these books out again, I believe in the 1970s, and that is when this edition comes from. So I probably read these as a middle schooler in the early 1980s. And if you haven't read the books, I suggest you do that at some point in time. The basic characters are the same as from the movie, but the outline of the plot is considerably different in that it was no dream that Dorothy went to the land of Oz to meet these characters, such as the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow, among many others. Another book I read back in the 1980s, Pierre Boyle, The Planet of the Apes. This is the movie tie-in edition from the 1960s. You see right on the front cover, now an exciting 20th Century Fox motion picture. Action shot of Charlton Heston right there on the cover. So I believe this was, looks like it was published. The book was originally published in about 1963 or 4. I'm not sure when this was published. So whenever, it would have been whenever the movie came out. And you could have picked this up for a whopping 60 cents at that time. Again, I picked it up at a used bookstore a little while later. Again, classic science fiction story. Love the movie as well. Another classic science fiction story that I read back in the 1980s was Fahrenheit 451. This is another used edition that I would have picked up at some point in time. This would have been only 50 cents if you would have bought it new. I believe this edition was printed, it looks like in March of 1968. So again, I picked it up at a used bookstore sometime in the probably the early 1980s. Again, classic science fiction story about the dangers of censorship and burning books and all those kinds of things. So it's been a while since I read it, so I don't remember all the details, but again, classic science fiction. Next story is Bound by Blood by Sean David Brink. I just have an e-copy of this, so I'm just going to hold up my Kindle, my brand new Kindle that my wife got for me for my birthday. That is a particularly important story for me because that is the first time an author reached out to me and asked me to review a book for my channel once I started my channel earlier this year. Bound by Blood is a Christian horror story involving kind of a supernatural battle between a demonic cult, and a local Christian church. And I reviewed that story on my channel. So it's more of horror perhaps than sci-fi or fantasy, although I think you could probably call it a version of urban fantasy, perhaps. Next on the list, Terry Brooks, The Sword of Shannara. For most of my life, I called this book The Sword of Shannara, but since BookTube, I have come to understand that I believe it's actually pronounced Shannara. This copy goes all the way back to the late 1970s. I think it's a first edition, first edition mass market paperback, May 1978. Again, this book gets a lot of flack for being a Tolkien clone, and that is certainly true. I wouldn't have picked up on that probably as a kid when I first read it. I did certainly when I reread it a few years ago. But Again, you have to remember that that is what the publishers were asking for in the 1970s, and Terry Brooks gave it to them. And it's still a fun story. I enjoyed reading it again, and may go further in the series at some point. Another recent read, Stormfront, the first volume of the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. So this, of course, involves the wizard who is also a private detective in Chicago named Harry Dresden. And I haven't done a review on it yet. I read it a while back, and then I reread it through listening to the audiobook by the fantastic James Marsters narrator. I don't know if I'll do a separate review on it. I may get a few books into the series, which I will listen to the audiobooks of that, since I think that's going to be my preferred way to read the series. So I'm looking forward to getting into that a little bit further. And if there's enough kind of content for me to offer my typical spiritual deep dive analysis, there was some in the first book. We'll see what happens after that. The next book is another book I listened to an audiobook, and I also have on Kindle, and that is The Cunning Man, which is by D.J. Butler and the other writer's name here, Aaron Michael Ritchie. So again, another book on the Kindle about 1930s Utah and a Mormon named Hiram Woolley, who is also a wizard of sorts. And it's just a fascinating story about a really good guy who is the hero and helps people out through sort of a folk magic. And so thanks to Sam of the channel iSamwise for referring that story to me, and I look forward to reading more in that series. The next two books, no surprise if you know my channel, Way of Edan, Prophet of Edan by Philip Chase. Way of Edan I read last spring and put up a review of the spiritual content of the book. Just recently have read The Prophet of Edan. The audiobook just came out earlier this week by the fantastic narrator Alan Walker of the Library of Alexandria. And so I'm going to listen to parts of that, and then I'm going to put up my deep dive review into the spiritual content of that story. I'm not going to give away the content of my review, but I believe Philip is younger than I am, so I'll just say, now that I'm 55, good job, young man, good job. I'm really enjoying this story, and I'm looking forward to reading Return to Edan soon. Next, Arthur C. Clarke, 2001, A Space Odyssey. This is also a movie tie-in edition, all from back in the late 1960s. This is a first printing July 1968. It picked up in a used bookstore again sometime in the 1980s. Classic science fiction, basically just the story of the movie. Probably should have been obvious to me that I was a contemplative back when I watched that movie and read this book in the 1980s, and lots of other people said, well, that movie and book are boring. It's just people floating around in space. There's no battles or anything. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was gorgeously made, and I think the story is really fascinating. And considering what's going on with the AI at this point, I think it's quite relevant. Next, Revenge of the Witch by Joseph Delaney. This is a YA series of novels. In England, they're called the Wardstone Chronicles or Spook's Apprentice books. In the United States, they're called The Last Apprentice. And it's about a young man named Tom Ward who is being trained by the spook because he is the seventh son of a seventh son, meaning he will have the ability to control various spooks and ghosts and demons out there I think it's set again in medieval England. I first picked up this series a while back. There was a movie adaptation of it starring Jeff Bridges, who did a fantastic job as a spook. The movie overall, not so great, but it's a great series. It doesn't get really talked about a lot in booktube circles, so it's something I may talk about at some point in time in the future. Next, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, aka Blade Runner by Philip K. Dick. This is the movie tie-in edition from 1982. This book was first published in 1968, but as you can see with Harrison Ford and a scene from the movie on the cover, this is indeed the movie tie-in edition that was published at the time the movie came out. Classic movie, classic story. Next, David Eddings' Pawn of Prophecy. This is the first book in the Belgariad, that another classic fantasy series from the 1980s. I need to go on and read the rest of the Belgariad at some point. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking about this series, but it is enjoyable. And so I look forward to getting back into that as well. Next, Stephen Erickson, Garden of the Moon, Malazan Book of the Fallen, Book 1. I read this a few years ago when I started watching booktube channels, whenever that was, probably COVID time, 5 years ago. I'd never heard of Malazan before, started hearing about it a whole lot. So I picked up this book, read it, enjoyed it. Was not a seasoned, again, it'd been a long time since I'd regularly read sci-fi or fantasy at that point. So I was lost at times. And I saw the size of the next books in the series, and I thought, I'll come back to that another time. Well, it's a few years later, and I still haven't, but I am going to re-enter the Malazan world soon through reading Ian C. Elsamhunt's Path to Ascendancy books, and then I'll go back to the Book of the Fallen. Next, David Gemmell, Legend, classic series again from the, I think this is from the late 80s or early 90s, if I remember right. It's been a while since I've read it, about Druss the Legend, an aging warrior. I should read it. I might find the story illuminating. Actually, it was published in 1984, so I probably read this in the late 80s or early 90s. Another book I read back in the 1990s, Harry Harrison, The Hammer and the Cross, first book of a 3-book series about Viking warriors. But there's also fantasy elements to this story because of the entrance of the gods into the story. This series does not get talked about much at all on BookTube, so I may have to reread it and offer some thoughts on that. I know Max Scarfield, Mac, if you're watching, I know he just read them not too long ago. So if there's other booktubers out there who've read them, let me know. Next, Robert Heinlein, Starship Troopers. Again, another classic sci-fi novel made into a movie there in the late 1990s. When I was looking through my collection, I noticed I picked up a lot of Robert Heinlein books back in the 1980s. Don't think I read all of them, but I certainly read this one. And again, enjoyed this classic piece of science fiction literature. Speaking of classics, what would a sci-fi fantasy list be without Dune from Frank Herbert? I read this probably in the late 1980s. This is an edition, mass market paperback edition. Looks like it was published in 1987. So yes, probably late 1980s that I read this. And hope to revisit again and read more in the series soon. Another book I would have read in the 1980s, the Conan series, the Ace paperbacks, are of course Robert E. Howard is the primary author of these, but this is the edition that also had works by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, who mixed in pastiche works and edited some of Robert E. Howard's works. I know it's somewhat controversial, but this is what we had back in the 70s and 80s to read of Conan. And I do have fond memories of reading that series. I hope to read the Del Rey editions of the unedited, pure, quote-unquote, Robert E. Howard Conan stories soon. Next, the Redwall series by Brian Jacques. Jake, not sure how to pronounce it. I couldn't find my copy of the first Redwall book, so I have Mariel Redwall. I think I read several of these back probably in the 1990s. Enjoyed this series when I was reading them. One of the best videos on BookTube is Brian Lee Durfee's review of Redwall. If you haven't seen that yet, it's great. It's funny. You need to check it out. Next, Wheel of Time. I've only read the first 2 books of the series by Robert Jordan. The Eye of the World, which I read actually a couple of times, and The Great Hunt. Reading The Great Hunt is actually what gave me impetus for starting this channel, as I was finding Jordan's religious world building to be fascinating. And while there's some videos out there that talk about that aspect, I thought maybe it's something that I could do a deep dive in at some point based upon my background. That will come someday. Next, Stephen King. A couple of books. I've read various books by Stephen King over the years, just a couple I want to highlight for you. The first really long book I think I ever read, 1,000+ pages, is The Stand. In 1991, they put out the complete and uncut version of The Stand. When it was first published in the 70s, it was a edited version. Stephen King wanted to publish the complete version, and so he did. And so I read this back in the early 1990s. A classic piece of apocalyptic literature in a post-pandemic world where most of the population has been eliminated, and there's a demonic figure named Randall Flagg who seeks to take over the world. I remember really enjoying it. Hopefully I'll read it again someday. Then The Gunslinger, Dark Tower of Book 1. I picked this up probably back in the 1990s, I believe. This is the first version of the story. King has gone back and revised it. I haven't gone on to read the series. If I do, I will probably have to read the revised series, as I understand that ties into the later books better as King went back and revised it. Next, Ursula K. Le Guin, Earthsea, Wizard of Earthsea, Book 1. This is it's a classic fantasy story that I did not read, I believe, as a youth, but I did pick up sometime in the last 6 or 8 years. I read the first book. I want to read more. Fascinating. Again, ideal for me as a contemplative, because there's a lot of food for thought that Le Guin offers in this story of this young man who grows up to be a great wizard. Next, C.S. Lewis. I also could not find my copy of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, so I have The Magician's Nephew here, representing the whole Narnia series. You're probably familiar with it, so I won't go into detail. This is a copy that I would have picked up later and read probably when the movies came out, somewhere in the last 15 years or so. Next, H.P. Lovecraft. I've offered some shorts on my channel, short videos on my channel, reviewing some of the short stories of this. Again, this is classic tales of cosmic horror. And at some point in time, I'll offer a more thorough review of the content of that book. Again, this is the Penguin Classics edition. There's 3 volumes of that in the Penguin Classics. This is the first volume, The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories. Next, I have read the first 2 books of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, and Clash of Kings. Much has been said about that. You probably know the story. I won't go into it. I picked these up when the TV shows started, and I read the first 2, and I thought, well, before I read books 3, 4, and 5, I'll wait for book 6, Winds of Winter, to come out, so then I can read all of them at once instead of having to reread them again. Read them once back in the early 2010s, and again when the book comes out. Well, as we know, Winds of Winter is still in the works, and whether or not it ever comes out remains to be seen. Next, Discovery by J.A.J. Minton. I have a review of this on the channel. John, Amy, and Jacob Minton. Wonderful story of cosmic horror, Lovecraftian cosmic horror set in the 1990s, told through various points of view. Lots of religious world building. Check out my review on that. I'm anxiously awaiting Strange Eons, Book 2. Next, rest of my books are on this side. 1984 by George Orwell. I read this in 1984, and this is the copy that I had at that time. Again, classic story, which talked about what the world would be like in 1984. Well, that didn't happen that time, but it's still a good read for us to remind us what totalitarianism and the threat that totalitarianism has, and to always be mindful of that. Little Fuzzy, H. Beam Piper. This is a kind of a classic science fiction story. Zarathustra was a Class 3 and uninhabited planet, and the chartered Zarathustra company owned it lock, stock, and barrel. They developed it, exploited it, and reaped huge profits without any interference from the colonial government. But then out of nowhere came Jack Holloway with a family of fuzzies and a great deal of evidence that they were more than just cute animals. These books were first published a long time ago and then republished in the 1980s. When I picked up this book, I believe they're now in the public domain. Michael K. Vaughan's channel talked about them a while back, and I think they were in the public domain. Next, J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter. Not much needs to be said about this. This is the American edition, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I've read the first 6 books. I never got actually around to reading book 7. I saw all the movies. I know how the story ends. So maybe someday I'll read book 7. Next, the only entry I have from Brandon Sanderson. I've only read 1 book of Sanderson. I know that's kind of hard to believe for somebody who does fantasy book reviews on a channel, but I've only read Elantris. I enjoyed it. Just need to go on and read some of his other books at some point in time. Next, here are the franchises that I talked about. First, we have Star Trek. So these are the movie tie-in editions of the first 3 movies. Star Trek, the motion picture. The book is credited to Gene Roddenberry. I think it was probably actually written by Alan Dean Foster. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan by Vonda McIntyre, and Star Trek III, The Search for Spock by Vonda McIntyre. Again, this goes back to my youth in the late 70s, early 80s, growing up on a rural farm. It didn't have cable television, didn't have a VCR. So when these movies were coming out, maybe I'd go see them in the movie theater, but then it'd be years before that I would see them again. And so the books were a way to continue to be familiar with the story. And that is why I also have Star Wars. Again, attributed to George Lucas. I think it was written by Alan Dean Foster. The Empire Strikes Back movie tie-in by Donald Glut, and Return of the Jedi by James Caan. Again, I just read these stories. You can just see by the condition these books are in from the late 70s, early 80s, how many times I read these. And amazingly, the very first page of the Star Wars movie tie-in basically has the plot of the prequels all spelled out right there. So I read lots of other Star Trek and Star Wars books, but those are the ones that are special to my heart because of the context in which I read them. Next, I've just read Cold Silver for Souls by Tori Tekken, another booktuber. We'll be offering a review on that soon, but it's a wonderful story about, again, the tagline, bounty hunter, necromancer, outcast, set in a fantasy version of the Old West. And what I love about it is that this woman named Hunter, who does these things, struggles from a faith perspective about her role as this necromancer and bounty hunter, and talks to a wise pastor about that. And it's just a really fun summer read, and I'll get my review up on that hopefully sometime soon. Next, again, what would a list be without The Hobbit, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. These are mass market paperback editions from the early 1980s. You can see how many times I've read them over the years. They're pretty beat up. It's been a while since I've read them, at least read the whole series, so I hope to do that again soon. Probably will do that by listening to the Andy Serkis audiobook edition. Another book that I read, this has probably been close to 10 years ago now, The Golem and the Jinni by Helene Wecker. This is maybe you would call an urban Jewish fantasy from the year 1899. Kava is a golem, a creature made of clay, brought to life by a strange man who dabbles in dark Kabbalistic magic. Ahmad is a jinni, being of fire born in the ancient Syrian desert. Struggling to make their way in 1899 New York, the golem and the jinni try to fit in with their immigrant neighbors while masking their true selves. I remember really enjoying that book, and I think that there was a sequel that came out, so hopefully I'll read that at some point in time. Final 2 books in the series. And again, no shock that this particular author would show up in my list of 55 books. Again, Gene Wolfe. This is Shadow and Claw, which is the first half of the Book of the New Sun, which is Shadow the Torturer and the Claw the Conciliator. I have a review on my channel of Shadow of the Torturer. I've talked about my thoughts in a couple of videos about Claw the Conciliator. I want to reread it before I do my deep dive video. And then the last book review that I just put up about a week ago, Pirate Freedom by Gene Wolfe. A swashbuckling story about a time-traveling priest who was also a pirate, and the story is offered as a confession of his deeds. So those are 55 books for 55 years. Thank you for watching. Peace be with you.